Welcome back to the Practically Pastoring Podcast. My name is Frank. I'm so glad that you are here. I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and 4 of the 5 men who are usually on the show are here today. Delmar is out on assignment, but we have Jeff from Baltimore, Maryland. We got Andrew Larson down in Safety Harbor, Florida, and down
I'm actually in Clearwater today.
Oh, in Clearwater. Yeah, the home of
the Threshers.
Scientologists.
Scientology and Andrew.
Yeah. And then I guess properly, you're in Trinity, Florida. We got Timothy Miller.
Hey. Miss you guys.
And so guys, I'm glad that you guys are here. It's cool to see Andrew eating a public sub while we're recording. That's great. We are months away still from the Practically Pastoring Conference, February 17th to the 19th next year, and we want you to go. If you're listening to this podcast, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, if you're watching this on YouTube or you're seeing this somewhere, I want you to come to the Practically Pastoring Conference. It's for pastors, and it's only $39. $39. That you can't find a conference cheaper than that right now. It's going to be great.
Amazing.
It's in Tarpon Springs, Florida, which is the home of Lakeview Church. We've been talking about it. There is, if you're trying to make a vacation out of it with your spouse, there's going to be a day where we're going to invite spouses to something very special with our spouses, and if you're bringing your kid down there too, we have childcare that's going to be provided for free for that moment. We got a lot of stuff planned, a lot of free stuff we're going to give out. There's going to be meals included in this. We even have a couple Airbnb beds that are available if you want to join a house with a couple other pastors who are going to stay for free. All this stuff, you go to practicallypastoringconference.com. If you have any questions or need some details, you can reach out to any of us. We would love to answer that question. But we want you there. We want your staff there. We want your ministry friends in the area to come. It's Florida in February, and all of us can attest. There's not many better places in this continental United States than Florida in February. All right, it's the most tolerable climate in Florida that time of year. It's during the school year, so if you were to go to the theme parks, it's a good time to go.
It's peak Florida.
Yeah. It's not raining every day at 1:00. Like it is. It's a good time. So we hope you can make it February 17th to the 29th. Sorry, February 17th to the 19th in 2025.
It's the 12 days of Christmas and the 12 days of Practically Pastoring. On the first day of Practically Pastoring, Frank Gill gave to me
your entire paid vacation for 2 years on this conference.
Exactly. If you need help to try to explain to your elders why you want to go to Florida in February, we can help you out. We got you. All right. Besides that, follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Do all the things. Let's dive into the first question. We have actually, it's not quite a question. I want to read to you guys a post on Twitter that I saw, and it's pretty provocative. I think it's pretty interesting, and so we're going to talk about it. So the post, I'm going to link in the show notes the post I'm talking about. So it started with this post from a guy named Jason Kovacs, who explains like a tip for pastors and churches on how to have a sabbatical policy. And he kind of goes into this big detail about like how you should do this and things like that. And his big like tip is for every 1.5 days of 1.5 days of every month worked, you should be given a sabbatical after 5 to 7 years. So let's say you work 12 months, you've accumulated, what is that? Like
18.
18
1.5
days,
times 12 is 18. I took college algebra twice, and my undergrad program was accredited, so I'm pretty good at math.
All right, well, that's a dig. Okay.
This goes right back to the conversation we had right before we started rolling about taxes.
So you get 18 days after a year, and so after 5 to 7 years, you can see how much that would accumulate. So anyways, kind of like not like a big deal, very common conversation within churches. But then this other gentleman named Jeff Wright quote tweeted him and said this: "It is wild to me, the sabbatical expectations that have become common among evangelicals. Can you imagine the welder in your church going to his foreman and saying, been 5 years, can I have a 90-day paid sabbatical? And he kind of goes on to kind of explain this kind of concept that like it feels, this is very like big evangelical, big like big church ideology that like pastors have this privilege to take sabbaticals where they're serving in congregations of like the average blue collar working person who could never get a sabbatical. It seems kind of grievous to him that we would even suggest that. And if you go through the comments, there's even other people that say this is dumb, like people shouldn't, like sabbaticals should not be expected or
start
even given.
Taxing churches.
I don't think it gets quite there, but like that's kind of the conversations happen. So, anyways, all I have to say is, I took a sabbatical 2 years ago. Andrew, you're about to take a sabbatical in December. Is that correct? Yep.
November, but yes.
Oh, sorry, in November. Jeff and Tim, I'm sure there's a desire to take a sabbatical. I don't think you guys are anti-sabbaticals. And so I guess in this conversation, like you hear this, and there is a sense that like, for sure, like there is people in your church who are in professions that can never take sabbaticals. At the same time, I know all of us probably have people in our church who are like CEO of companies who actually do get, or even like tenured professors who do get sabbaticals. And like, that's a real thing in those areas. So like when you hear something like this, and I'm guessing Jeff is a Christian. Yeah, he's a Christian. He probably comes from a place of like thinking very practically in this congregation. Oh. So, yeah, you are too. How would you respond to this? How would you respond to someone in your congregation who's like, why do you get this? Why don't you satisfied with the 4 weeks a year that your church is offering to you, whatever the vacation time you get? How do you respond to this?
As someone who is about to do this, what I said to my church at our business meeting in the spring was, I'm taking extra time this summer, and then I'm going to be just gone for a season in the fall. And in our denomination, it's another perk of having a denomination that you can point back to. In our denomination, it is stressed that at the 7-year mark, we need pastors to get away for a season to realize that the church will survive just fine without them. And we need the church to realize that the church will survive just fine without their pastor as well. So it is some rest and some study time for me that's more focused than just vacation. Again, I have 4 children, so I can't disappear for the whole summer because I've got kids. That wouldn't work. And so it is not a vacation time. It is a more focused time than that. And it is for the church and for the pastor. It's a kind of a reset to let us both know that we need each other, but also that what God is doing is bigger than one person.
Yeah, that's really good. I have not taken a sabbatical. I'm not against sabbaticals. I've been on staff now. January will be 15 years. I took on a pastoral title in 2015, so that'll be 10 years of a pastoral title. Technically, I should have already taken one. I just, during the transition of me into the lead pastor position, just the timing was not right. However, I have been on staff during a sabbatical that our lead pastor took, and this exact sentiment was spoken out loud by many different members of the congregation. So we did have this conversation. I think as Andrew stated, it was really good to talk about this well before it actually happened. I think even a written policy would be great. That way people understand the why behind it, why it's necessary, or why we as a church practice this. It comes back to, really crystal clear communication. But at the same time, like, I get this argument. Like I have wrestled with this argument in my own heart when I've thought about talking to my elders about a sabbatical. It's like, well, like our plumber didn't get one. He's been at the company for 22 years. You know what I mean? Like, so that same thought process is, I think it's valid. Like, why would we not have this conversation? I think it would be a miss if we just pushed it off and said, yeah, well, this is just something we do. Like, no, let's talk about why we do this. So I think, Frank, when you took yours, I asked for the documentation that you put together, which I thought was really well done. It was very clearly spelled out. It had the why in there. It had what was, what you would be doing on that sabbatical. I think all of those things are necessary. It's not just a 30 or 60 or 90-day paid vacation. It's very different than that. So I would go back to very clear communication between you and your leadership team, the elders, and then how do we present this to the congregation so we can answer questions up front and not just shove people off to the side when they have legitimate questions like this, but how can we engage in these conversations? And I think ultimately you're going to have to make that call as a church. Andrew, you're right. Having a denomination helps, especially when it's practiced. Like, this is what we do as a denomination. But I don't think it solves the question. Like, you still have to answer that question. So, valid question. I think it's a good conversation.
I think there's a few different directions that I would think about this in, because I am in a context where a lot of my folks are like shift workers. They're not white collar, workers. And there's some blue collar folks in my church who are like, great salt of the earth people. But first and foremost, I would echo what Andrew said about denominations and clear guidelines. And it's good to talk about those before you just say, hey, I'm going to go on a sabbatical. And also to define terms. A sabbatical is not a vacation. It's not the same thing. And to go back to like a welder or a plumber, if those guys are working for a good, reputable company or even themselves, they're probably going to go to trade shows and things like that. And so you could view that almost like in the same vein as what a sabbatical would be, at least part of it for somebody like a pastor. But part of the reason that it is a long-standing tradition for vocations like pastors and professors and those type of vocations that have sabbaticals and things like tenure built into them is because they are not the same as being a welder or a plumber. They're not more or less important for society. Obviously, we need plumbers and welders and electricians and stuff. But the steel that you're welding together does not have affairs with other steel, and it doesn't like lose loved ones, and it doesn't call you in the middle of the night to go to the hospital. But people in your church do. And so there's just a different kind of emotional strain that comes with being a pastor. And it's not like I'm not upset about that. I signed up for that. And so kind of the more harsh way to say this is like, we signed up for this vocation. You signed up to be a welder. You knew what the deal was when you signed up. So, the bitterness, I think there is an element of it that's a discipleship thing where people need to understand. The hard, tricky part is that it probably can't be you that's primarily discipling the people on you taking a sabbatical. You probably need to have elders and other like wise leaders around who can say, hey, our pastor works hard. Like, understand that what he does is not just nothing. So I will say that if people in your church think that you're not doing very much and they don't understand what you do, then yeah, there will be more bitterness and conversation. But if at least most of the people in your church are like, I don't know what he does every day, but it's apparent that he works pretty hard and he cares for us and he's teaching us really well, I think you're going to have a much easier time going, hey, I've been here 7 years, and based on my denomination, I'm getting pretty close to being due for a sabbatical. I
tried to get you to come with me. I sent you flight information and everything.
I didn't say no yet.
Okay, I'm just saying the hotels are paid for, so
okay.
The rental car is booked. Now the second part, when my wife is coming with me, yeah, you can't come be a part of that.
I'm out.
But you can come do a Highlands tour with me.
All right. Well, we'll see. I got to talk to my wife about her being at home with the 3 kids by herself. So we'll see. Yeah, we'll see about that.
See, I've had 3 years to build up my wife too. Yeah. Hey, I'm going to Scotland for like 10 days by myself.
Yeah.
Have fun.
Right. But yeah, that's what I mean. My take on it is, yes, it needs to be a big open discussion. Like, I would say like a year before you're starting to think about it, or at least like if you're going to go on sabbatical in the summer, start talking about it the fall before that. So that it's not like, oh, hey, by the way, the pastor's leaving for 6 weeks to just go hang out. Because that's how, people misunderstand, and then that's how conversations start, and that's how bad things happen. But I just think they're not the same vocation. I'm not a welder. I'm a pastor. And being a pastor has different stresses and different things that come with it. And so, welders are not on call 24/7 to deal with the emotional stress of people that are close to them, who are also their friends. And there's that whole thing of mixing relationship, across lines of, coworkers and friends and people you're ministering to. So there's just a different kind of stress, which is why it's a long-standing tradition in the pastoral vocation that sabbaticals is part of it, because we realized, hey, if we don't do this, pastors are going to burn out after this amount of time. So I just think that you have to differentiate between the two kinds of work.
Well, and we could get super spiritual and play the etymology card. It's a long-term. It's a longer version of the word Sabbath. I mean,
Right.
that's what sabbatical comes from. It is a godly principle that it is a focused time of rest because it is necessary. It's and why do we Sabbath? We Sabbath to realize that we are reliant on God. That's why God called the nation of Israel to the Sabbath, so that they would take a day to realize, hey, I could get more work done. I could get ahead at this, and this, but I'm going to take a day to rest in my dependence on God. And so whether it's 7 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it may be, it is a purposeful pullback so that you can realize, hey, God's got this church. This is not the first church of Andrew. And if I drop dead, the church is still going to continue on just fine without me. It might take a month, a week, or whatever the season may be, but God's got the church. It's not my church. And ironically, the one person in my church who raised their eyebrows and had a bunch of questions when I mentioned I was going on a sabbatical was a retired union welder. So he's not the guy who was tweeting, but it's just kind of funny that
ironic.
That's the what we have on this tweet as the example. But I think once his big concern was, well, who's preaching when you're gone? And it was, well, we've got this lined up in the summer when I'm gone, and in the fall that'll come together a little bit later. But here's what I'm planning for that. It was like, oh, okay. And then once they knew there was a plan in place, it was done. But also for me, like I'm going to a sabbatical study program at a seminary. I think it's dangerous. And I'm not saying don't go fishing or don't go golfing when you're on sabbatical, but when you're on sabbatical and you're posting your sabbatical selfie every day and you're on the golf course or you're holding a bass, don't do that. Don't, and if that's what you do to relax, then fantastic. Do that, but you don't need to be advertising.
You don't have to share everything you're doing.
You don't have to share everything you're doing, and especially when you have people that are wondering, how is this different than a paid vacation? If you're doing what you would be doing on vacation, maybe don't share that with the world.
Well, not even just that, but it's funny that I have some pastor friends who don't post much about their church and their ministry, but they're always posting of their vacation or their leisure time, whether they're fishing and stuff like that. And I know that maybe they fish once a week, but the way social media algorithm is, that's all they post about is whether it is spending time with their family or fishing or golfing or whatever the case may be. But there gives this illusion that because that's all they post, that they actually don't do any real ministry, and they just the lie that some people think that a pastor's only working on Sunday mornings and they don't do anything during the week. And it's I'm sure this guy is working, but he's curating a social media look that looks like he doesn't do anything. I think that could be really tragic on a sabbatical where you actually do have more time back for yourself and you're just posting all your leisure stuff. But Tim mentioned this, Andrew, you're doing this. It's when I went on sabbatical, I spent a good portion of that time actually in churches, talking to other pastors and hearing, it was an opportunity to learn things and gain skills that I couldn't do in my regular rhythm of work. And then in the midst of that, I was able to find some deep amount of rest that I couldn't do in my regular rhythm of work. I'm skimming through this guy who's replying and making all these comments, and there's a good chance he might listen to this. So I don't want to disparage him in any way. And I think I understand where he's coming from. There's this one tweet he has based on the replies of people defending sabbaticals that this is his concern with the church. He says that there's this woe is me pastor motif that is set in, and it's a lie that people have, especially pastors, have bought into. And he actually took a screenshot of a Gospel Coalition article that talked about pastor, you're not crazy, that thing that they're doing over there, and so he says that this is kind of a lie pastors are believing, that we're just all troubled people. The other thing is that there's a pastor as a victim industry, and that it's a growing market. That we are victims. We're so everything's so hard for us, and that's why we need this rest. And the disconnect between working folks and pastors is very wide. So,
but if that wasn't the case, what would the bloggers have to blog about? So there has to be the pastor's the victim mentality. Otherwise, no one would be able to sell their courses.
Pastor as victim is just vocational clergy church hurt.
Yeah, that's a good way.
That's all it is. Yeah,
I again, not in a disparaging way. I don't think Jeff likes the book by John Mark Comer, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. I don't think he's going to enjoy that book, because like there's this concept that from reading the replies and reading his responses, he's like, in the same way a foreman or like a plumber or a welder has to come in, work 40 to 60 hours every week, put his head down and work, like a pastor should have that same kind of attitude. And like,
but a welder doesn't have the possibility of working 150 hours a week because of just new ideas that happen. Like in that metaphor, if you're let's say like a line welder, or you're a framer on a job site, unless you're working for somebody who is trying to just cut corners and go as fast as possible, you're just going to work 40 hours. And that's hard work. Like framing and construction is very hard. I did it for, I've done it a few times when I wasn't in ministry. So like those guys have my utmost respect, blue collar guys, but it's just not the same. When they go home, they're just at home until the next day they go on the job site, unless you own the business, and that's a whole different thing. But the average just blue collar welder is not thinking about welding when they go home. And there isn't just new ideas like nobody's coming up to them in job site and being like, hey, we should start a new welding class. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But as pastors, that's happening to us pretty constantly. There's always new things to be doing. If you're in an old church building, there's always another thing that has to get fixed, another project that comes up. It's just a constant stream. And before you know it, you can be putting in 40, 50, 60, 70 hours and not actually accomplishing very much.
And also what a welder does is not what I'm basing who I am off of. Like I'm trying to follow the model set by Jesus, who very actively and regularly took time away. He pulled himself apart from the disciples. He went alone by himself to pray, or he was in a season of very, very public ministry with thousands of people, and then he retreated with just him and his disciples for several weeks. So I think this idea of, well, that's not how the world does it. Well, good. We're not supposed to be basing our model of how we are doing our ministry off of trade unions or expectations of how the world is doing whatever they're doing. We are supposed to be basing how we serve and how we minister as to whether or not we're being faithful to what Jesus has called us to do. And if that means I have to go to Scotland for a few weeks in November, then I will be obedient to Jesus.
I think one thing that the original poster has said that I want to agree with is that pastors shouldn't be lazy. They should be working hard. And they like I think every pastor that I know personally that I think they deserve a sabbatical, work extremely hard. And to continue to use the welder illustration, it's not like someone at 8:00 at night goes to the welder and says, I need you to come to my house and weld something. Right. But people will text you or call you at 8:00 at night. It's like, I need you to come to my house. There's an emergency. And then the pastor gets up and goes to their house.
If you do contact a welder and want them to come at 8:00 at night, they're making a lot more money.
Yeah.
It's not just part of their full-time employment. So,
yeah.
Now, I will agree with...
You're my welder. Of course you're going to come.
Right. I will agree that if there is a big disconnect between working folks and pastors, that's a problem. Like, that is a problem that shouldn't be.
And I think the concerns that he has, I think Andrew is on the nose here. I think there's a disconnect in his understanding of what Sabbath means. And I wonder if there's even like a greater disconnect of what does a regular Sabbath rest looks like. And this is why I made that joke about John Mark Comer, because I think he that's what the whole book is about Sabbath rest. But I do understand that there is this weird I think he thinks sabbaticals are for pastors who are soft. And I think he thinks that even the suggestion of having a sabbatical means that you are soft as a pastor, which I would argue having a sabbatical is to strengthen pastors who need to be strengthened after working very, very hard. And if you want to see longevity in the pastorate, sabbaticals might be the medicine to endure another 15, 20 years. Though you might not see a lack of output in sermons or whatever, what you might start seeing is like sinful things, sinful like habits and practices start seeping in, because pastors will cope. They're going to cope in some way with the workload, and if they're not finding it in rest and trusting in and being like fed by the Lord, they're going to find it in other ways that might not be that will not be healthy. Anyways, Tim, we're gonna say something.
Yeah, I think we had this conversation a little bit with the last episode you posted, Frank. I know it was kind of a repost, but there was the idea of a sabbatic rhythm, not just a sabbatical every 5 to 7 years. And I actually I showed a clip in staff meeting last week with Lakeview and our staff members. And like literally one of our staff members gave it a standing ovation. Like she was so excited to hear this idea of, hey, every 7 Sundays, you're required to take off. I was like, that's a really bold move. And it's not you get a week off of work. You still work throughout the week. Just that weekend, you get a chance to be a normal family that weekend. Like that concept just absolutely blew my mind, because we're not a normal family ever on the weekends, right? Because as pastors, like we work every Sunday. So I like the idea of not just a sabbatical every 5 to 7 years, but also a sabbatic rhythm in your church, and not just for the pastor, but for your staff members as well. So we are talking about this as a church and what this would look like. And I think, Frank, you and I talk about it a little bit, but it would require a lot of planning, to actually pull something like this off, because you still have to get Sundays covered. And sometimes it's more work to get it covered when you're not there. But when I told my kids, what do you think about Dad every other month getting a Sunday off where I don't need to be there and we get to have a weekend as a family, like basically every other family gets almost every single weekend? And they were like, you're joking, right? I'm like, no, it's kind of an idea we're floating around. So I like that discussion too. So not just every 5 to 7 years, which means I would, as a dad, I'd get one sabbatical with my kids. You know what I mean? Like that.
Yeah.
I like the
That's
idea
what I was
of more
saying.
regularly doing this, not extended time periods, but just these little breaks that we need.
Yeah. For me, the idea of like a 6 or 8 week sabbatical did not make sense because of the life stage that we're at. And that's kind of what I communicated when I had people, both in the church and the denomination kind of pushing me, was that it's a great plan. And when you think of a sabbatical, you usually think of your professor with his elbow patches on his sport coat and and a pipe sitting by a fire reading. And that would be wonderful if it were 15 years from now and my youngest kid was graduated from college. But in this season, that's not what makes a lot of sense. And I think the idea of sabbaticals or Sabbath that works for your season is something that we need to talk about, because they can't all look the same for everybody. One thing, and I realize that the welder argument or the plumber, we're using these straw man arguments here, but all of the arguments for these very blue collar positions, they're all unionized positions. They're unionized trades, and if you are a decent welder, you're going to be in a union, and there's going to be someone who's looking out for you, who's taking care of you, who is making sure your rights aren't trampled on. The vast majority of pastors in the United States are like, there are pastors that look at me and Jeff as solo pastors that have a full-time salary and are like, man, wouldn't that be nice? Because right now the median church attendance is about 73 people in the United States. So most pastors are by themselves doing everything, and there is no union looking out for them saying, hey, you can't work more than 40 hours a week without overtime, or you can't be abused by the elder or that one lady that donated the stained glass, so she thinks that she gets to be in charge. So there are so many perks about being a line welder or working on an assembly line at the Honda plant in Youngstown, Ohio, that, man, that would be great if we got that as pastors, but we don't, because it's a different vocation. So you can't compare apples to apples, or whatever other analogy you want to use. Not all jobs are the same. Yeah, and we chose it. And more times than not, we are grateful for it. But it's different. Or, let's not just go blue collar to clergy. My best friend from high school went to Embry-Riddle and is an aeronautical engineer, and is making like 7 times what I am. And now his vacation, he gets like 3 months vacation a year because of some things that he's done at his company. I don't stomp my foot and say, how dare you not treat me like a C-level employee at a Fortune 500 company. I went to high school with him. That would be ridiculous. So why would someone point at one vocation and say that pastors should act like that? Different vocations have different rhythms and different rules for how they function.
I'll end with this, and then we'll go on to a question from our group. It's interesting as I'm reading comments from the original post where he was giving that like 1.5 days for every month worked, and there's a lot of pushback, not from the guy we were talking about, but from other people, and it's really interesting. Like, there's a lot of like basically comments is just like, it just seems tone deaf to even suggest that pastors should get a sabbatical compared to other people. And like I hear that and I resonate with the tension here, but like as we've been saying, it's like it is a unique position, not minimizing anybody else. And I would argue that everybody should like find more ways of accessing rest in their life, like even non-ministry related people. Like I read somewhere like in Australia they offer like if you work for a company for if you work for the same organization for 10 years, you're required to get 12 weeks off in the year, some like really long vacation time. And like, I mean, I think there's like studies that show that like we were not created to be working as crazy of the amount of time that we've been working. But anyways, all I to say is all the links will be in the show notes. I'm gonna post this in the comments of these Twitter threads to see if I get roasted. But but I think these are really interesting discussions. And if you have thoughts about sabbaticals, and you're right, Tim, the last thing we talked about was sabbatic rhythms was a repost, and that was a very interesting discussion that was really encouraging to me. And I think a lot of churches, if you follow those sabbatic rhythms, you may be able to push off an actual sabbatical even longer than 7 years or 10 years, because you actually have some consistent rhythms of rest that could be really beneficial for you. Hey, so we talk about this often. If you post in our Facebook group, if you search for Practically Pastoring on Facebook, you look for our Facebook group, we have this thing that if you post anonymously in our group, there's a high likelihood that we will see it because it piques our attention, and that we'll talk about it on our podcast. And this one was very interesting, and so I want to share it with you guys. A few years ago, a church I was connected to nearly imploded after it was revealed that the worship leader was having an affair with a member on the praise team. Since then, the same praise team member has bounced to a few other churches, always almost immediately finding a way onto a stage in some worship leading capacity, and then leaves in a few months with a mess behind them. Today, I saw that person leading worship and prominently featured in another church in my network socials. Should I reach out to the pastor, whom I'm friends with, to make sure he knows the true backstory, or should I mind my own business? Hot stuff right here.
Yeah,
hot
apparently.
Stuff. What do you guys think? What should this person do?
I think my my pastoral reaction is to say you should tell your friend, because I'd want to know that if that was happening and this person was, leading worship in my church. At the same time, I think it's a mistake to put people too quickly on the worship team and in front of people. So if your friend is like immediately putting this person on the stage, I might talk to him about that as well. But the cautious part of me says, be careful, because this could potentially open you up to like a defamation lawsuit. If you go to somebody without being asked or without any kind of, and you're like, hey, this is a bad person, I think there's potential for that person to come back and be like, hey, that's defamation. You can't do that, especially when it comes to like recommendations for jobs. Like if this was an employment situation and you went to her potential employer and said, hey, I wouldn't hire this person because they have this history, that could be pretty bad. Even being asked, would you recommend this person? And you, in your mind, know, like, no way would I recommend them because they have affairs everywhere they go. You're probably better off just saying, no, I can't give a recommendation. But it's kind of tricky because, like, on the one hand, yeah, I would want to know if I was the pastor, hey, this new worship team member is like basically a cancer in your worship team and is going to probably cause chaos and pastorally needs some deep healing apparently because they keep doing this. But also, like, man, if that's the character of that kind of person to be kind of like a wolf in sheep's clothing, I just wouldn't trust that they wouldn't try to come after me if I sort of ruined their next thing.
I have been in a similar situation recently, and just to play devil's advocate, I know all of the comments in the Facebook group are, you need to tell this person, you need to tell this pastor. But if you are that pastor and you don't know, you don't have to do anything. And I realize how that sounds like as I first start saying it. But once you know, then there's a whole can of worms that it opens. What does it say about, assuming that the pastor has a paid worship leader on staff that has recruited this volunteer to come in? So what do you do if your worship leader knew and you didn't? So there's that can of worms that opens. There's all the defamation stuff that Jeff was talking about. This is a volunteer person coming in. This is not a staff person. So what standards do you hold volunteers to that is different than what you hold your staff to? And then let's say things are going well and they're right with the Lord and they're walking with the Lord. How long after an affair should someone be put on the sidelines for before they're allowed to serve in a church again? If, assuming they've joined your church, in our membership class, we don't say, hey, have you had an affair in the past 10 years? Is that a question that we need to start asking somebody before they join the church? And if they are a member in good standing of the church, I don't know what people leave out of their testimonies when they're joining a church, but I'm guessing that if I had an affair a few years ago, I would not be telling that story to the new members class. So I definitely understand why the church would be like, hey, this is a great vocalist. We should get them on stage as soon as possible. But for all of the reasons that Jeff mentioned and the additional staff headaches, I would almost rather. So I think there's probably an obligation to tell your friend if you're this person posting. But if I'm the friend, I would rather not know. As the pastor, I would rather not know than know and then have to step
also,
up and
like,
deal with it.
This person who's going from church to church like this probably knows all the right answers to give at this point. They have rehearsed, and they may not even realize how manipulative they can be. They may not even be doing it with malice and intent, but they just have learned how to play the game of like, yeah, I just love the Lord and I just want to serve in the worship team. And that's all the right answers that a pastor who needs a good vocalist needs to hear. And we are, let's be honest, we are weak for that. Like, we see a new vocalist come in that's really good. Let's give me the right answers. Yeah,
we are
we're
desperate for
like,
good musicians,
and we will put somebody on the platform pretty quick.
It's so tough. But if you know the guy, I feel like that does make it a little bit easier. It's not like I've been in a situation where I saw someone that I previously worked alongside of at a different church, and I didn't know the church. I didn't know, the pastor. They never reached out for any sort of, reference or anything like that. And I'm like, okay, there was no serious sin issues there, but had I been reached out to, I would have had an open conversation with the pastor about some things that, that we dealt with. But in this situation, there's also a really good chance he already knows. Like it's possible, Jeff, to your point, that there could be a high level of manipulation there where maybe this individual was like, hey, here's my background, here's what and maybe this person is truly repentant. I don't know, right? Like maybe there has been like heart change, life change. So that's the other side where it's like, okay, to Andrew's point. So what's the timeline? Like, at what point has it been long enough since you've, committed that one particular sin, and now you're allowed back on stage to be in a worship leading fashion? Like those are all really messy, difficult
to
conversations.
be a volunteer. You're not on staff.
That a great point.
At what point
Yep.
do we say, hey, this person is allowed to volunteer at another church that's not much? Shoot, at what point do you say this person's allowed on staff or on stage at my church again? You know, from what I'm reading, it was they were never on staff and they had an affair with a staff member. Okay, that's messy.
Yeah.
They should probably not be leading worship the next week. But in this day and age where clergy power abuse or whatever the phrase is that's being thrown around, it is a scary time.
I would probably open the conversation with you might already know this. I just, I saw the socials, I saw the post, just wanted to fill you in and kind of see where the conversation goes from there. Yeah, it's messy, but like our job as pastors is to kind of live in that messy environment.
It's messy, and so is grace. If grace wasn't messy, then none of us would be in the positions that we're in.
Reason to have like a handbook for different areas of service in the church, worship team handbook. I think I don't know whose socials it was on, but there was a church talking about they had a 4-week onboarding for worship team. And I was like, man, that's a long time, like a month. Somebody's a great vocalist. You wait a whole month. That feels like forever. But a month is not that long. It's only 4 Sundays to take them through some kind of process where maybe you do say, hey, we really want to create a safe place here where people can grow spiritually. And part of that is making sure that, as someone who's going to be up in front of the congregation, sort of whether we like it or not, people are going to view you as an example because you're in front of them. That's just human nature. We just want to talk about things in our past, and here's, so that might be a great way to just, even if you just have a 1-page, some kind of application to be on a worship team, I think that's probably pretty smart, especially if your church is bigger. If you're in a very, very tiny church, that's my situation. The pastor could probably be, have just a personal relationship with all the people on the worship team and just kind of know them. And I'm trying to think, I don't think we've ever had anybody join the worship team very quickly. It's usually at least been a couple months of them attending before they joined the team.
Yeah, because they got burned out by the other church that they were at, that they said, I'm going to show up and just take a break and be part of the congregation. We had a thing recently where the debate was, is someone, if we have, we don't have full-time staff position, we have part-time staff people who are our worship leaders. They are the staff position. They are held to a different authority, and everybody else on the praise team is a volunteer. And so we had people that were upset about one of the volunteers, and I said, should that person be allowed to bring a casserole? Because, we eat together as a church every week. Should they be allowed to sign up to bring food? Should they be allowed to sign up to work the parking lot? Should they be allowed to sign up to hand out bulletins? What is the difference then between them playing an instrument? And it's like, well, there's leading and then there's serving, and how you define the different roles, I think, is important as a church. And I don't think there's a right or a wrong way, but I think they need to be clearly defined so that when a situation like this happens, you can say, I understand what you're saying. Absolutely. This person is serving. Yes, they are serving with a microphone, but it's no different than the person serving, handing out the bulletins, directing you where to park. So chill.
I will say, Andrew, to your point, there is a way to go about this with different positions. For us, if you want to teach a small group or a home group, if you want to lead in any sort of capacity, including on-stage leadership, you actually are required to go through the covenant membership process of Lakeview Church. And we actually started this about 6 months ago because we had a similar situation with members of the worship team. And our worship leader came to me and said, I'm pretty new in my role, and I'm actually pretty uncomfortable having some of these conversations right now because I don't know these people well. And
Jeff, I say this to you as the most talented musician in our group. Talented musicians are just the
prima
worst.
Donnas. You're too artsy, too much feelings.
You guys are tough.
It's like, come on.
I told our worship leader, would it make your life a little bit less stressful if we as elders actually owned some of this and we vetted people that then when they came to you, you know, they're actually cleared because they're now covenant members of Lakeview Church, and they go through a vetting process before they become members. And if they're not able to become a member, then they're not able to join the worship team. So for us, it makes it very, very simple, because then it doesn't fall on our worship leader to make that call. They've already been vetted by the elders before they get to that process. So
there's actually like some really smart there. It's very 9 Marks of you too. Like 9 Marks has a very much of like, if you want to participate in the serving culture of our church, you have to be a member of our church. But like, I was actually thinking the whole time, you know, with the defamation aspect of what Jeff said earlier, is like, you know, if you are a member of our church, then we have the authority to speak into like any like habitual sin or like things that might require church discipline. And then even beyond that, like unless there's a formal process of not being a member of your church anymore, if you were to go to another church, you would still be it would be you running away from church discipline as a member of a church. And I think that the sad thing about this is like, I mean, Tim and Andrew, you guys are really close to each other. And unless someone from Andrew's church is running away from their church, from membership discipline to your church, Tim, you're probably not going to hear about it from any other church. Like you might have new people come in your church all the time that are running away from discipline, and you would have no idea. And they would maybe say, oh, we went to X church down the road, and, you know, we're just looking for a new church. They won't tell you that, like, you know, they had an affair and they got caught and they don't want to be there anymore. Like that stuff won't get brought up unless you find out later. And sometimes, you know, when you start talking to certain people and you're like disparaging the church they came from a lot, you kind of maybe like, well, have your spidey signal go on, like, maybe I should check in with that church and what they're running away from, because they're talking a lot of trash. And I know the church and they don't seem whack. This sounds like unbecoming of them, the way they're trashing them. But like, I think there's some merit to like, hey, if you want to serve in some kind of major capacity, you have to be a member. And therefore, if you're a member, you are submitting to whatever moral clauses that you are stipulating to be a member of your church. But I will say, Tim, that like, this is something that we've been thinking about here at Epicos. And it's like, then you limit yourself from having people who can serve in non-necessarily forward-facing or high-impact places in the church that could be used as a means of discipleship or a means of even evangelism. Like one of our campuses, there's no parking, so it's all street parking, and sometimes people have to walk across the street, and it's a pretty busy street, so we have a crossing guard. And so like maybe your church, you have a parking team. Like, would you prohibit someone who maybe you will say yes, and you're fair to say this, like, does someone need to be a covenant member of your church to be in the parking team, Tim? Yes or no? Like,
no. We have clearly defined roles of, if you want to be in this area, you need to be a covenant member, and the parking team is not in that list.
And that's great. So like, you've created, like,
they also have a hierarchy of sins, which some sins are worse than others. And you know, that's
it's the only way we know how to
I do think there's like we've had this conversation a million times. Like, oh, there's a keyboard player that's really talented in their church. They are an openly gay man. Like, is that something that you're willing to put on your stage, even if you are a non-affirming church, and they understand that? Like, what are you going to do about that situation? You know,
yeah, Tim. So would you?
Just kidding. Hold on. Or like, or a divorce.
They wouldn't be able to be a covenant member, so no.
Or like a divorced woman serving in the kids ministry, right? Like there's these different scenarios that like
it's almost like one sexual sin we're willing to look over and another one we're not. Weird. You know, if there's biblical prohibitions of both and we draw lines and one is accepted and one's not, it's almost like we're bigots. I've been down this road and it wasn't a openly gay man. It was a non-binary teen playing the keyboard at my church. And it was listen, if you are willing to kick every divorced adult member off the praise team, then we can start talking about the teenager that wants to use weird pronouns. But
Yeah.
if we make a policy that has never existed before based on one 19-year-old, I'm going to throw down with you, because you're making a policy for one person. So I think the idea of having a policy for members is excellent, but you have to have that policy in place, not in response to one person. Because if you have that policy in place, or I'm sorry, if you make a policy in response to that one person or one particular sin, then yikes, you're opening yourself up for all kinds of hurt.
And not just that, but you're gonna be chasing that down everywhere. Like you're gonna be playing catch up in the entire time, because I actually think there's a lot of good merit to having, like, hey, these are the areas where you are required to go through covenant membership, and these are areas where if a person right off the street wants to join our church and like wants to start attending our church and they want to serve in this area, they're welcome to do so. I think like consistency is very important, because in all those areas there's aspects of discipleship that needs to happen. I think like the scenario that's happening in this anonymous poster, if this person is literally bouncing from church to church, when you meet with that person and says, hey, we what brings you to our church? Oh, you used to lead worship over here. Well, what brought you here? And you hear that there's like every 6 months they're at a new church and they're doing something new, like that should raise my eyebrows and question what's going on here. But I also know, like, I don't know the size of this church. There's a lot of variables in this question that I don't really know about, but like I do know, like Andrew and Jeff said, people are hurting for musicians, and so they will overlook a lot of things and say, we have a talented person here. Quite frankly, as long as they're not like naked on stage, let's get them up there and singing, right? Like, and that might be the situation where people are at. I think that, Tim, the fact that you're in a position where you feel comfortable saying these are the boundaries to be in these different roles is a it's a privilege, but it's also like a very forward thinking situation where now you're going to save yourself a lot of grief, even though on the back end there's going to be a lot more difficulties, because there might be 10 new musicians that show up at your church tomorrow that say, I want to play drums, I want to play guitar, and you only have 2 drummers and 1 guitarist, but you're going to say, check back with us in 2 months when we have our next membership class. We would love for you to be there. And if the Lord wants them to be on the worship team and whatever
by then they're playing at the mega church for $100 a week.
Accurate.
Yeah. Well, this is a good conversation. These conversations will continue in the Facebook group. We want to hear from you there. But yeah, if you have a question, the quickest and fastest way would be posting it anonymously in our Facebook group. But don't hesitate to DM the Instagram page or to reach out to us and be like, hey, here's a real situation in our church. I want to remain anonymous, but could you guys help talk about it? We want to hear more about it. We're not experts, but we have a collective brain trust here of several decades of ministry, and we can maybe hit close to the target in terms of helping you out. But we also have experts coming on this show. So we have actually a person who will be on next week's episode, who is going to be a youth ministry person. I'm really excited for you guys to hear from her. And we got some exciting shows coming up in the future. And before we go, Jeff, we have a book recommendation for our weekly book recommendation. Jeff, what book do you have to recommend to our amazing audience?
Radical by David Platt. You should definitely. Just kidding. Don't. Not,
that's only funny for like the 12 people who are on Twitter aggressively and know the drama there. Okay,
you're welcome. Also,
it is a good book. All of us college students. Okay,
it's not a bad book. All right. The book I decided to recommend is called Transforming Conversion by Gordon T. Smith. It just kind of looks at revivalism and the way that we think about salvation and conversion being kind of like this interchangeable idea. Takes you through the history of some of the ways that different parts of the church across the world have looked at the idea of conversion. So it's just a really good kind of deep dive into that idea, which is, pretty central. It's kind of our thing. So it's just one of those books where you kind of think through something that you're attempting to do every week all the time, which is see people converted, and just asking the question, like, what does that actually really mean and what has it meant in the past? And I just really like him as an author. So Transforming Conversion, Rethinking the Language and Contours of Christian Initiation by Gordon T. Smith.
The link to this book will be in our show notes, so you can look for that there. But thank you so much for listening. join our Facebook, join our Instagram. We want to keep this conversation going. We're on YouTube. We've been posting shorts a lot on YouTube. We've been posting reels on Instagram and Facebook. So make sure you check that out. But with all that being said, we hope to see you next week. Come to the conference.
I'm Jeff
Frank
Simpson.
Gill.
I'm Andrew Larson.
And I'm Timothy Miller.
We miss you, Del. See you next week. Bye.